Understanding and configuring RDP and PCoIP. So all kinds of acronyms, huh? The RDP is the Remote Desktop Protocol, and PCoIP is the PC over IP protocol. So two different protocols, two different options for how you might make your virtual desktops available to users. Now it's interesting. This is kind of a challenging. This whole storyline is a challenging one because there has been kind of an ongoing battle for protocol supremacy. RDP's been around for a long time. PC over IP is a protocol that used to be known as Teradici that VMware kind of acquired in some way from Teradici, the company, the protocol from the company of the same name. RDP being Microsoft's protocol with remote desktop services. Also in there is, in the Citrix world, Citrix's ICA protocol and the HDX protocol. So as you can see, there are a whole lot of these remote desktop-like protocols that exist in the world. And figuring out which one is that works for you can sometimes be challenging. So I'm gonna just kind of outline how these protocols are configured, and I'm kind of more or less leave it to you to determine which one you prefer. Different protocols provide different advantages. Okay, in this version of VMware View and on top of this version of Windows Server, Windows 7, the RDP protocol will give you support, for example, for Aeroglass, the pretty layer that sits over the top of the Windows interface. PC over IP with this version doesn't support Aeroglass, but PC over IP can support, for example, better communication or better compatibility with a number of different USB devices that is out there. Also, full motion video and 3D applications can sometimes be better using the PC over IP protocol. But again, it's kind of your mileage may vary with these two, and I'll show you kind of some of the unique differences in what you see between the two. And at the end of the day, let you decide what works best for your environment. In this nugget, what I do want to do is show you the different settings that are available and how you may configure these different settings so that you can configure, again, the user's experience when they're working with their virtual desktops. There are some settings inside of VMware View. We've kind of seen these before, but I want to highlight them. And then I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the group policy configuration for PC over IP. It is here in group policy where we get really very detailed and very granular in how you can tune this protocol for the usage that you see in your environment. There is, if you do plan on using RDP, there is one little tiny setting that is required for View to work with RDP, and I will tell you what that is here in just a second. So relatively short nugget this time, but again, I'm using it as an opportunity to show you what these two protocols are and just to give you an idea of the differences between the two. So here I am actually on client1.company.pri. I have actually already launched the VMware View client here, and I am working with one of the virtual machine snapshots that we created back earlier in that linked clone virtual pool. One of the things I want you to notice here is using PC over IP. Notice how we don't have Aeroglass. So I don't have the transparency that I'm used to seeing with Windows 7 when Aeroglass is turned on. If I log out of this instance and then log back in to either the same instance or whichever one it gives me, instead of PC over IP this time, if I log in using the RDP protocol, I can show you that things look just a little bit different. The majority of which being what this screen that you're seeing right here, this Windows 7, the logon screen looks like. And then also, once the logon completes, that we actually have Aeroglass up and running. And so there you see it after the logon. Now, this logon looks quite different because, well, I can see transparency through the start menu and then also through when I hit the start button over here, up here on the left. So again, kind of important difference here between what you see in PC over IP versus RDP. Very difficult to show videos, but I could potentially also show you two different videos and kind of highlight the differences between the two. I think honestly in your own testing is where you're going to find the differences in what works best for your environment than to try to show you a bunch of differences. And again, my job here is not to necessarily say one is better than the other one, just pick the one that works best for you. So back in vcon, back here in vcon.company.pri, Taking a look at the linked clone pool that we created earlier. There's that linked clones pool. And there is one area for settings that I want to focus you in on. Here under Edit, and then under the Pool Settings, if I scroll down just a bit, I can identify what the remote display protocol is going to be that I'm going to make available for the users. Now, by default, the default display protocol is going to be PC over IP. I mean, VMware spent all that money for Teradici, so they might as well make it the default protocol. You can set that to something else if you want. And you'll notice down here, however, that Windows 7 3D rendering is not enabled, even if you have PC over IP turned on. And the reason for this is because you have to actually forbid people from using RDP if you want to enable Windows 7 3D rendering. Okay, so some interesting configuration there. Also need to set the maximum number of monitors here, and when you'll notice when we do that we actually eliminate the ability to adjust the resolution of any of those monitors. If I choose the configure button here, this will allow me to adjust the amount of virtual RAM that's tagged to that guest, to that virtual machine. If I extend or increase the amount of virtual RAM for each virtual machine, I get better performance for 3D applications, but at the cost of consuming more physical RAM. Okay, so you can dial this slider up if you want and get better experience, but you're going to pay more in terms of the amount of RAM you have to set aside for each concurrent client. Down here on the bottom, also some Adobe Flash settings. These are also related in sort of to the protocols. And you see that, just as we mentioned before, there are three options here for the Adobe Flash quality. What level of quality do you want those Flash objects to get rendered at? And then also, do you want to enable throttling of Flash? Now, Flash can be really processor intensive. There's a lot of stuff that can go on. And so throttling Flash here gives you the ability to say, all right, well, you're only going to consume so many resources. I'm not going to allow some kind of Flash object or some sort of Flash animation to consume a bunch of resources and soak them up for this virtual machine. Those are really the settings that are worth looking at here. Okay, once I set those settings, they're automatically available down on the client, and you'll notice that when we go to the client, there is no longer an option to choose between PC over IP versus RDP. Now, in addition to all of these, those are kind of the course level settings. In addition to all of these, there are also some very fine-grained control that you get through group policy. Okay, let me bring up my Active Directory domain controller here. And I have, in this case, I'm configuring the client, but I'm bringing this up so that you can just merely see what these group policies are. I have already brought in the VMware administrative templates, the ones that we did back in that previous nugget. And here I'm taking a look at the PC over IP session variables. Okay, this gives me some of that fine-grained control over how PC over IP is going to operate inside of the environment. Some of which are overridable, some of which are not overridable. And you'll notice that if I click these two, that the two sets of configurations are exactly the same. So which of these settings do I want to deliver as, I'll call them preferences, and which of these do I want them to set down as policies so that they're not overridable by users? Okay, a couple of these we want to pay attention to. One of the big features of PC over IP is this notion of build to lossless. And if you think of all the different potential videos that are out there, or user experience items, to use a more generic term, when we work with different protocols, those protocols will attempt to give the best experience possible to the user by cutting out portions of whatever that video or other item is that's being rendered at the client side. So one of the things that PC over IP tries to do is start out with a very bandwidth optimized transfer of that data. So again, if it's like a video, for example, and then slowly build towards lossless, meaning I'm not throwing away frames. Okay, and what I have by leaving this in its either unconfigured or enabled or disabled state is that when I have those videos and they are across existing connections, that as the connection is recognized to be better, I'm going to slowly build that video experience up to complete losslessness. Now, what's interesting is if you disable this feature, or excuse me, if you enable the turning off of this feature, that can actually assist in preserving some of the available network bandwidth. I'm not going to keep trying to build towards a lossless user experience. So if I have a user, so the network connection between the user and their desktop is one that I'm not very confident in. If it is a high latency connection, a low bandwidth connection, I may consider turning this off because, well, it will assist in ensuring that I got the best user experience, even if I don't have the best video-based user experience. Now, what's interesting is VMware wants you not to turn this off, so you actually have to accept the change to turn off the build to lossless feature, which in all of my years of working with group policy, I've never seen a please verify that you don't want to do this checkbox in any of these group policies I've been working with. So if you do enable this, you'll have to check the box and then you can hit the OK button. I'll hit cancel to cancel out of it. Now the rest of these items are really more granular ways in which you can kind of tune that experience for users. You think about this. Do I want to configure the maximum session bandwidth for a PCoIP session? Okay, is that 104 kilobits per second is the maximum I'm going to allow per session? Remember, these sessions can be concurrent too. So I've got to ensure that I've got enough bandwidth in the pipe heading outside of my environment so that I can support all the people trying to connect in. By setting a maximum bandwidth, I may potentially impact the user experience, but I do so in allowing more users to exist simultaneously. Do I want to configure the session message transaction unit, the MTU? Okay, set this to a very large size. This is commonly related with jumbo frames. If I set it to a very large size in a very reliable and high-speed network, well, then I can get a lot better throughput. But in an unreliable or highly latent network, well, setting that MTU size down a bit will ensure better reliability for my packets. Do I want to set a session bandwidth floor? Okay, so there's a maximum bandwidth, and then also do I want to guarantee a certain level of service for the users that are connecting in over PCI over IP? Do I want to enable or disable audio or the microphone noise and DC offset filter? Okay, this can reduce some of that ambient noise that exists in microphone communications, typically through VoIP. Do I want to set a max on the session audio bandwidth? Okay, audio can, when you think about it, your MP3s are 128 kilobits or 256 kilobits. Well, those are actual data that has to transfer if you're trying to run MP3s through a connection. So do I want to limit that bandwidth? Do I want to use different session encryption algorithms, meaning either AES 128 or SALSA 2256? One of those has to be enabled. Okay, I can't disable them both. Do I want to configure which USB devices are allowed or disallowed? Okay, that if you want to ensure that people aren't connecting up large hard drives and sucking down the entire intellectual property of your environment, well, you might want to restrict hard drives as being a USB connected device. I can change TCP and UDP ports. Same thing down here, the client UDP port, and also which virtual channels are authorized. Okay, different feature sets are going to be supported on different virtual channels. And if I restrict certain virtual channels, well, then just those feature sets will not be available. Clipboard redirection is one of those big ones that I think a lot of administrators tend to forget about. Clipboard redirection, especially in the extranet situation or out on the internet situation, can be handy. In other words, restricting clipboards, because you may not want, again, your users to be able to copy and paste large amounts of data or intellectual property or code from their connection inside to the outside world. Okay, so disabling that can be handy if you're concerned about security. Do I want to configure the image quality levels? Okay, do I want to set a number for how much is the maximum or minimum amount of image quality as it's going about its algorithms for defining, well, how much data do I need to send across? Setting a lower image quality value, again, will will decrease the amount of data that's required, which means there's potentially a better user experience, or I can aggregate users together better. Do I want to set a client image cache size policy? You know, it's generally a good idea to set up a reasonable image cache on the client. The clients are going to make use of that image cache, and if the image that it's attempting to come down hashes with one that's in the cache, well, you very quickly can bring that image right out of the cache. Okay, this has the illusion of making that whole user experience that much better. So you don't want to keep it, you know, this is not something you're going to make too big, because there are obviously limitations in sizing of cache, but that reduces potentially, if you have duplicate images, duplicate objects that end up coming down, well, I might not have to bring them down. Okay, I'm going to allow the protocol to use its own internal mechanisms rather than just trying to brute force that data down from desktop to client. Do I want to change the right shift behavior? So left shift versus right shift there. Do I need to enable FIPS 140-2? If you're a government entity, do you need to use the FIPS 140-2 approved mode of execution? Do I want to enable access to a PC over IP session from a vSphere console? Okay, can be handy for troubleshooting, for looking over the shoulder of users or fixing problems. Changing default input language synchronization. Do I want to set up an alternate key for the Control-Alt-Delete signal, or what we think of as the secure attention sequence? Bonus points if you had any idea what the SAS was before I mentioned Control-Alt-Delete, by the way. Oh, if I enable this, I can set this to essentially whatever I want. Okay, and that allows me, in situations where Control-Alt-Delete gets captured by the local computer, well, maybe I can set that to something else so that I can get separation between what the local computer receives and what the remote computer receives. Do I want to use enhanced keyboard in Windows Client if available, or do I want to disable sending CAD when users press Control-Alt-Delete? So you see here that most of these have to do with, again, tuning down all the different possibilities of these feature sets built into the PC over IP protocol so that, well, I can get the best user's experience. I can't tell you what to do here. I can't tell you which settings to set and what to set them to, other than if you go out to wherever your users are connecting in and adjust the settings and see what works, well, that's a good start. Many of us, especially if we're supporting users that are outside of the office, may make use of a WAN simulator, okay, a device that actually pretends or creates a pretend slowness in the network to help us recognize which ones of these actually are going to be useful. So these are specific to PC over IP. I will tell you also that for remote desktop protocol, from RDS, under, let's see here, Windows Components and Remote Desktop Services, there are some settings here for the Remote Desktop Connection Client, for licensing for the Remote Desktop Session Host. So you may be able to adjust some of the protocol stuff in here as well, again, just to make that whole experience better if you choose to use RDP. There is one setting that I want to point out specifically here as we're talking about RDP. Okay, VMware is going to try to push you to PC over IP, and it makes sense to. A lot of with discounting the whole non-support for Windows Aero, the other features and functionality, especially with 3D rendering enabled, is it's kind of worth it, honestly. If you do want to use RDP, there's one setting you have to be conscious of, and it's back here in the client. Okay, the default setting these days that almost all of us configure for our remote settings on a computer is this bottom item down here. So if you're going to turn on remote desktop for a computer, most of us click the bottom item here because we're interested in more security when given the option between more security and less security. But this bottom selection here that requires network level authentication, or NLA, between client and server doesn't work with the VMware View client. If you set this to the bottom setting, you're actually going to get a somewhat obtuse error message that says that the remote desktop session closed unexpectedly. So make sure if you plan on doing RDP that you use this this middle button and not the bottom button. And a double bonus points if you know what the difference is between the middle button and the bottom button. Do you know? So network level authentication came out with Server 2008, I believe. Essentially changes the order in which a session is presented and you end up authenticating to that session. So in this middle button here, when you have that turned on, your remote desktop session will be presented to you. You'll have an open connection to a remote desktop computer, and from there you'll enter in the password, the username and password. With the bottom one selected, you actually have to enter in the username and password first before you're actually exposed to the session. So important difference between the two. That's why this bottom one is considered to be more secure, because you don't have an open connection until after you've authenticated. Just a little bit of trivia there if you're interested. So these are kind of some of the settings here associated with RDP and PC over IP here in VMware View. What have we talked about in this nugget? Really that the PC over IP versus RDP debate continues to go on. In this version, PC over IP has got some really great improvements. RDP still supports Windows Arrow. So my advice, use what works for you. You know, whatever your users are willing to accept, use what they would like the most. Then here in the interaction portion, we talked about how to configure the protocol settings within VMware View. I showed you the very small number of settings that are available there. And then I also then dug fairly deeply into the group policy configuration for PC over IP. I kind of hinted at some of the RDP stuff as well. And then I pointed you specifically to that one setting you have to be careful of to ensure that you've got set for the View client. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.